The MCAT Cars Podcast, session number 26. The Cars section of the MCAT gives thousands of pre-meds nightmares every night. Whether you're an ESL student, lack confidence while reading, or a slow reader like me, Jack Weston and the medical school headquarters are here to help you score higher in every section so you can be confident you're ready to get the MCAT score of your dreams. Welcome to the MCAT Cars Podcast. My name is Dr. Ryan Gray, your host here every week. And as always, I'm joined by Jack Weston from jackweston.com. If you are struggling with cars, you need to go sign up for Jack's daily cars passages that get sent right to your email inbox. You can sign up for those at jackweston.com for free every day in your inbox. And if you're looking for more personalized coaching from Jack Weston, check out his MCAT Cars course, which you can find at medicalschoolhq.net/jackweston. Using that link will take you to the course page and give you $100 off his course. I get a little commission from that. You get to save. I get a little bit of money. We all win. This week, we have a great passage, great article talking about tuberculosis and architecture. Jack Weston back for some more MCAT Cars podcasts. How are you doing today?
I'm great. How's it going, Ryan?
It's going well. I'm excited to continue on with our cars journey, helping students try to understand. You know what the most exciting thing that I see with this podcast is when students ask about cars prep and organically other students are saying, hey, go listen to this podcast, the Jack Weston Medical School Headquarters MCAT Cars podcast. It's really helped me change my thinking. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I mean, that's the goal, right? To reach as many students as we can and help whoever is willing to listen.
You got it. So what do we have in store for our passage today?
So today we're going to look at I think a very interesting common passage that they could throw at you, where they give you a topic that you're probably aware of or have heard of, but they discuss it in another way that you may have never been open to or recognized. So it's interesting. It brings in a new element into a discussion that we normally don't have. So I'm excited to see how students react to this kind of passage.
Okay. All right. So again, if you want to follow along in your podcast app, just go to the description and the link to the article is there. You can follow along at our website, mcatcarspodcast.com. All right. So this is a citylab.com article. Paragraph 1. Since the widespread use of antibiotics to treat tuberculosis started in the 1950s, most people have forgotten about the disease that was, at one point, the deadliest illness in America. All right, so first sentence here, giving us a little bit of a background with tuberculosis, talking about antibiotics, treating it, and then also giving us a little bit of a background about how it used to be the deadliest illness in America.
Right. Okay, sounds good. So they're giving us some kind of disease. They're explaining it. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead.
But go back 2 or 3 generations in your own family, and chances are you'll find at least one relative who was affected by tuberculosis, also known as consumption or, quote, the white plague. So just giving, I guess, an example of how widespread it was to say, hey, somebody in your family was probably affected by this as well. So pretty common.
Right. Now, they do something interesting here. They call it consumption or the white plague in quotes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's to signify or show you that they can use different terminologies to express the same thing. And that is something the MCAT loves doing. They love using different words to express the same thing. So don't be surprised if they start calling it the white plague or if they start calling it consumption. You are now responsible for knowing that tuberculosis or TB, it can also be known as consumption or the white plague.
Would a question potentially ask like something about consumption and not calling it tuberculosis?
Typically, no. They'll use the actual word that they have been using the entire time, but it can happen. The most apparent use of this is when you're reading the rest of this passage.
Okay.
And that's when it can really throw you off. When
Yeah.
you're reading the rest and you have no idea, you'll see consumption and go, what? What is consumption? I never saw consumption, right? If you weren't paying attention, you won't notice it. But yeah, they'll probably call it tuberculosis. I mean, that's usually what they'll do, but you never know.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Paragraph 2. Death rates from TB peaked in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, exacerbated by overcrowding, lack of sanitation, and poor nutrition. So TB may throw off some people who are like, wait, what's TB? Because it's interesting. They didn't define TB as a short form of tuberculosis, but that's what that is. So they're just saying here that the death rates peaked because of these things: overcrowding, lack of sanitation, poor nutrition.
Exactly. Now, this is very ironic, right? We're talking about the fact that they will bring up different terminologies and you're now responsible for them. Here you have a terminology, TB, right, an abbreviation that we did not otherwise specify.
Mm-hmm.
And you're still responsible for it. So they don't have to tell you these are the other names. That would actually be very kind of them.
Yeah.
Right. In this case, you are just supposed to be sharp enough to realize that TB means this tuberculosis. I mean, it means the same thing. So in a way, when you're reading, you should always pay attention to what you have read before. And something I always tell my students is always ask yourself, why was this mentioned? Why are they bringing up this? Right. And you will easily connect, oh, TB is tuberculosis. It's the same thing. Right. They're just abbreviating it for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay. Now, the other thing I want to mention is you don't need to know anything about TB. I mean, if you go to medical school, you'll learn a lot about it. Right. But you don't need to know anything about TB going into this passage. But they do tell you some things that actually affect your chances or your odds of having this disease, right?
Mm-hmm.
Overcrowding, lack of sanitation, poor nutrition. I'm not saying that you need to know this outside of class or outside of this session or this passage, but now that they have explained it, they expect you to know this.
Yeah.
They expect you to associate poor sanitation and poor nutrition or lack of sanitation, to TB.
I can easily see a question like, what increases your risk of transmission? And it talks about like being in a jail that is 300 people oversubscribed, right? There's more people than it can fit, or lack of running water. They don't use the exact words that they're saying here, but it's all the same.
Yeah, they'll do that. It's an inference, right? You have to infer, oh, lack of sanitation or overcrowding is this or that. That would be actually on the easier side of what they could do, because this sentence is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't see that on the MCAT as much as you would on the DAT. The DAT would be very all for that. This is a great passage that resembles the DAT in some ways because it's about diseases and ailments, and they'll go into specifics on them, and that's kind of what the DAT does with their reading comp. But the MCAT differs in a major way. And instead of asking you specific questions about what was discussed, they ask you about whether or not that discussion is viable, whether or not it's even worth discussing. You see that extra, like, deeper level of thinking that they expect from you? It's what makes the MCAT so difficult, in my opinion. Okay.
All right. Between 1810 and 1815, the disease accounted for more than 25% of deaths in New York City. So just giving a little bit of numbers here to signify how deadly it was and how prevalent it was. In 1900, it was still the country's third most common cause of death. So, very common. So deadly and common.
That's it. Yeah, it was at least at one point very common and deadly, right? Okay, sounds good. Let's go ahead.
Robert Koch discovered the tubercle bacillus in 1882. So we're given a name and given to say, hey, this tubercle bacillus in 1882. So this is maybe I have to infer that this is what causes tuberculosis and the guy who discovered it in 1882.
Excellent. Yeah, so this is probably the source of or the stem of TB, and yeah, that's really it. Go ahead.
As germ theory became better understood, medical professionals knew that isolation was key to prevent the spread of tuberculosis. So germ theory, I think a lot of students would start freaking out here and be like, oh, what's germ theory? I need to know that. But let's just play with it as if we don't know it. So they're saying, as this theory became better understood, physicians figured out that you had to isolate the patient to prevent spread.
Right. And yeah, that will freak out a lot of students, right? Germ theory, what the heck? What is that?
Yeah.
Well, they're explaining it to you, right? It's probably a theory where if you get close to people with it, then you're going to probably get the disease, right? And if you're isolated, you're away, maybe it's preventing the disease, right? I mean, that's all you know, and that's all we can use. So it's totally fine if you don't know exactly what germ theory is. There is always that one student that comes out of the test and contacts their friends or whatever family and go, oh, you got to know germ theory, you got to know this or that. It's not necessary, right? I mean, you'll probably go on Wikipedia and go, oh wow, I wish I knew this or that, but you don't need to, especially for the sciences. They'll talk about things that you've never heard before, but as long as you stick to what they tell you, you should be able to answer the question. Okay.
A person's best hope for recovery was to live somewhere with plenty of fresh air, sunlight, rest, and nourishing food. So, the assumption, I guess, is that this is before antibiotics. They're saying back then the hope was live in this place, fresh air, sunlight, rest, and nourishing food.
Okay.
The standard of care for TB was primarily environmental, and the design of sanatoria influenced modernist architecture. All right. So now I'd be completely freaked out because I'm like, oh, architecture, right? I think I took an architecture class in college, but I don't remember modernist and what that means. So I'd be really scared here what they're trying to tell me.
This is where it gets hard, right? This is exactly what the MCAT will do. They'll give you a common topic that you're probably familiar with or have heard of, tuberculosis, right? I think that's pretty, something that most students have heard of before. And then they relate it to something that you have never heard of, modernistic architecture. I mean, what is that, right? Like how does that even relate to tuberculosis? So the key here is the design. The design of something influenced modernist architecture. So what is sanatoria?
No idea.
Can you guess?
The design of sanatoria. So I would assume sanatoria is what they're saying is the hope for recovery is something that has fresh air and sunlight and can provide rest and nourishing food.
That's it. Some place where you're, kind of like just recovering, kind of like a rehab center, right? So you don't need to know the history between for sanatoria, but it's essentially like a hospital specifically for like long-term illnesses like TB, right? And that's back in the day, they're using a new term that you've never heard of before, but you were able to associate it to the recovery part, right? The recovery of plenty of fresh air, sunlight, rest. So something about that is hopefully influencing or is influencing modernist architecture.
Yep. Okay. All right. So assuming I continue on in this paragraph and don't just skip ahead, let's read the next paragraph here. The sanatorium movement began in Europe in the mid-19th century with resorts in Silesia, now Poland, Germany, and Switzerland. So now they changed the name a little bit from the design of sanatoria to the sanatorium. Maybe one's plural and one's singular, I'm assuming. Yep. So sanatorium being this place where patients can go for recovery.
That's it. Now, look, even if you didn't know what it meant, they're defining it for you, right? They're telling you what it is. So all you got to do is keep reading. Keep reading, and it'll clear it up. Most students give up halfway through.
Yeah, I would.
There's a really good quote from the founder of Alibaba. He's a really smart Chinese billionaire, right? And I love this quote. It's basically like if you if you keep going, or most people quit in the morning, and the winners are the people who succeed are the ones who stay, keep going until the next day. Or basically, it's a reference to the fact that you just can't give up. You just shouldn't give up, right? And eventually, something will click, something will happen. And I think that's half the battle. Is don't get intimidated by these new terms or modernist architecture. Keep reading. Who knows? Maybe it'll clear it up. It's kind of like a puzzle, like we talked about before. Okay, go ahead.
All right. Davos was once the tuberculosis capital of Europe. So, just giving a little bit of context of something, a place. Although they began as collections of cottages in mountainous locales, sanatoria evolved into purpose-designed buildings intended to limit the spread of germs while providing key ingredients for recovery: dry, fresh air, and sunshine. All right, so there's the definition, right? Sanatoria are purpose-designed buildings intended to limit the spread of germs while providing key ingredients for recovery, which include dry, fresh air, and sunshine.
That's it.
So I think the biggest takeaway for me is literally when I'm reading this, I would have started freaking out, like architecture and sanatoria. What are these things? So just trying to convince myself in the moment to take a deep breath and just keep going and see what happens.
Yeah, and the only way you can do that is by preparing, right? By seeing this multiple times, by acknowledging that this will happen, by doing multiple passages in a row, right? Because doing one at a time is hard, but doing 9 of these in a row, by the 7th one, if this happens, you may crack, right? I like to compare MCAT cars to like boxing, right? Like there's a guy or girl who's trying to knock you out. So are you going to get knocked out, or are you going to keep getting up, right? And I'm telling you, by the 8th passage, by the 9th passage, most students are ready to, knock out, like just stop, right? And knock it up. So that's what makes the difference between a great score and a mediocre score.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So keep going. Let's go ahead.
Next paragraph. The first tuberculosis sanatorium in the United States was founded by a doctor named Edward Livingston Trudeau, who had consumption himself in the Adirondacks town of Saranac Lake, New York in 1885. All right, so they're now spreading to the U.S. Before, in the previous paragraph, they talked about Europe, and now we're talking U.S. in 1885. And we're given this doctor's name, and we're given consumption, right? So we have to connect that to, consumption, that means TB. And then we're given the location of where this was.
Yeah, and it says this guy had consumption. He had TB, right? So, okay, interesting.
All right. A key feature of the buildings in Trudeau Center was a glass-enclosed deck known as a, quote, cure porch. Okay, so just understanding that they had these glass-enclosed deck. Tubercular patients would spend much of their time resting on recliners on these porches, even under layers of blankets during the winter months. So, just talking about these cure porches, specifically, it's interesting they focus on Trudeau's center and the U.S., so maybe they may make some distinction in a question about cure porches in the U.S. versus not having them in Europe, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, and if you're visualizing this, you can sense kind of the atmosphere, right? Like imagine you're on some porch, you have blankets on you, you're coughing. If only these guys had streptomycin, but overall, like the visualization of this can help you understand the author's perspective, the author's picture of this. Okay, go ahead.
All right, next paragraph. The design and construction of specialized sanatoria coincided with the advent of modernism. So again, it's just like, we're bringing up architecture again. So I would just go, keep reading and see what they want to tell me. Architectural elements like flat roofs, terraces, and balconies, and white or light painted rooms spread across Europe. So they're defining modernism here. Flat roofs, terraces, and balconies, white and light painted rooms.
Yeah, so they're going back to the idea of what the sanatoria trying to influence modernism, right? Architecture for modernism. Okay.
Not unlike the sanatorium, the new architecture was intended to cure the perceived physical, nervous, and moral ailments brought on by crowded cities. All right, so now they're trying to make a little connection here, it looks like, between the sanatorium and this modernist movement, modernism, and why the movement is saying that it's trying to cure physical, nervous, and moral ailments, and not obviously tuberculosis.
Yeah, this sentence is so confusing. Look at the first two words.
Not unlike.
What the heck?
Yeah.
Why would they do that, right? So if you ever see a not and an un or any two negatives, you can cancel them out. It's kind of like math, right? When you multiply a negative and a negative, you get a positive. So if you have a not and an un, just get rid of them. So like the sanatorium, right? The new architecture was intended to cure the perceived physical, nervous, and moral ailments brought on by crowded cities. So it's just like the sanatorium, right? They're using it as an influence, right, to kind of aid in this mentality.
Yep. Okay. Part of the appeal of flat roofs was the extra outdoor space they created, which could be used for sunbathing, then known as heliotherapy. So the flat roofs, they're saying people could use them as extra space.
Yeah, and heliotherapy. Imagine you're gonna go sunbathe and you're gonna go tell your friend, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna do some heliotherapy today."
Dude, that's the perfect pre-med joke. Like, where you going? Getting my heliotherapy on. It sounds like you're doing something important. Obviously, therapy sounds important, and you're really just going to relax on the beach.
That's funny.
I like it. In 1925, the Swiss architect Le Corbusier dreamed of a city where every citizen's house was whitewashed and hygienic. So we're given another name here, an architect this time. We're outside of the medical world now. And he wants to have a whitewashed and hygienic house.
Okay.
Quote, there are no more dirty, dark corners. I'll finish the quote here. Everything is shown as it is, then comes inner cleanliness. So Le Corbusier is saying he wants whitewashed and hygienic, and it's interesting the kind of tie-in with cleanliness and germs. I think that I don't know if they're trying to make that connection, but it just seems like it stands out a little bit.
It definitely is. Yeah, no more dark corners, right?
Yeah.
So we can assume that modernism, right, is more about, or modernism in architecture has no dark corners, right? It's more light. I mean, they kind of bring that up. They bring up the fact that there's extra outdoor space. You can use it for sunbathing. So there's probably more light coming in, and yeah, it's kind of interesting how they relate cleanliness to light in some way. Okay, so what do you think is the purpose of this passage or article? Like, what is the author trying to get at here?
So it's interesting. It starts off, and we've had a bunch of these where it starts off with one thing and then it completely switches to something else. So they lead with tuberculosis. So my mind wants to think, oh, it's all about tuberculosis, but it ends here with this modernism, this architecture, and it's making a connection between how people designed these sanatoria and how the modernism architecture movement kind of followed in that footstep.
Exactly. So a common trap that they're going to use is that they're going to bring up a lot of answers about TB. Those typically end up being the wrong answers because that's not the point of this passage. It's not about TB. They could care less about TB. What they care about is, do you understand its connection to the modernist architecture? You understand that it influenced modernist architecture. That's the big point the author wanted to get across, but they had to establish the definition and how TB existed in order to get there. So if you only read the first paragraph and nothing else, or the first two paragraphs, you may be jeopardizing your score. You may be in for a big hurt because these questions will revolve not just on the first two paragraphs, right? The main idea is not something that comes up in like the first paragraph or the last paragraph. In this case, it kind of was emphasized in the last paragraph. It's something that it is driving the author to write this passage. That's the main idea. What drives the author to write this passage? And it's really to explain to us that modernist architecture was influenced from these TB hospitals, these kind of therapy places, right? And yeah, that's all you really need to know. And I love this passage because you normally don't make that connection with TB or some ailment and architecture, right? Where if we didn't read this passage, I don't think anyone would have thought about a sunroof or whatever they called, this terrace as being part of the history of TB, right? So, I mean, I think that in itself is interesting. And but when you're reading this kind of passage under pressure, you probably could care less.
So as I searched through like Zillow and Houzz and all these fun websites and Pinterest for ideas on like decorating my house, I'm gonna be like, thank you, TB. Thank you, TB. Thank you, TB.
Yeah, now you can go tell your friends or whoever, oh, by the way, did you know that this design was influenced by TB?
Yeah.
And they'll probably think, what? Like, where did you come up with that?
Yeah.
Oh, I read it in a Cars article. Cars. Okay, cool.
All right. So obviously, another big takeaway. Again, I like to focus on mindset as much as possible, and I honestly, if I were reading this in my MCAT or on my MCAT on test day, I would freak out because I'm like, why are they talking about architecture? And I think if we can just leave you with taking a breath, calming down, keep reading, because there may be some definitions later on that you don't know initially. Yeah,
and expect it. Keep an open mind. Many times students do not want to learn while they're reading, right? And they just don't want to embrace learning as you read. And the MCAT car section is all about learning as you read, embracing what they tell you, appreciating it, accepting it. So yeah, that goes a long way.
All right, so there you have it. Another Cars passage in the books. If you find value in this podcast, I would love for you to take a little screenshot right now, post it onto your social media, whether that's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, or even if you're a big Reddit user, big user of SDN, go post and tell students, hey, if you're struggling with cars, go listen to this podcast. It's free every week, right to your device. I hope this was helpful for you. Don't forget to subscribe so you can listen every week in your podcast app. We'll see you next time.